Laura to introduce our speaker today. Just a short review of some of the technical aspects of today's colloquium. Today's talk will be recorded for the purpose of dissemination on the PSC YouTube channel. This includes also the Q&A part of the talk. If you have any questions, please post your questions in the Q&A box. If you have a clarifying question during the presentation, please use the raise hand tool, and then I will call upon you to ask the question. So with this, I would like to invite Professor Annette Leroux, who is the Stanley I. Shear Term Professor in the Social Sciences and Professor of Sociology, to introduce our speaker today.
Well, thank you very much, Ilana. It's a great pleasure to be able to welcome Judith Levine to the department, to the Population Studies Center workshop, which I just learned was scheduled last year, but then had to be rescheduled. Judith Levine is the Associate Professor of Sociology at Temple University, where she's also the inaugural director of the Public Policy Lab in the College of Arts and Sciences. She's a mixed method scholar of poverty, gender, and work. She studied under Christopher Jenks at Northwestern, where she received her PhD in 2006, and that was followed by a Robert Wood Johnson scholarship in health policy at the University of Michigan. She's published extensively in the areas of inequality, but the most notable book is her award-winning book, Ain't No Trust: How Bosses, Boyfriends, and Bureaucrats Fail Low-Income Mothers and Why It Matters. And this book is based on in-depth interviews with low-income women, both before and after welfare reform. We're extremely pleased that she's giving one of her very first talks on her newly funded study by the Russell Sage Foundation and the Spencer Foundation, entitled Landing a Job, Moving from College to Employment in the New Economy. Please join me in welcoming Professor Levine.
Well, thank you so much, Annette, for that introduction. Yes, I was scheduled to speak with you last March 16th. I think I was your first, I know I was your first cancellation due to the pandemic, and who knew it would be a year until we could make it happen, but I'm really glad to be here now. So let me share some slides and I will dive into the talk.
Good.
Yeah. Oh, great. Thank you, Ilana. I asked for a confirmation that you could see the slides. I want to start just by thanking the funders, Russell Sage and Spencer, and also generous funding from Temple University and the study team, including both graduate students and undergraduate students, the graduate students, and very soon to be former graduate students, Keith McIntosh, Sienna Hurd, and Kendall Laparo, have been real partners in collecting a lot of qualitative data and helping me manage it. I'm very grateful to them. Just to give you a quick roadmap for the talk, I'll start by talking about kind of what inspired the study and a little bit about the literature on college as the great equalizer across social class background. I'll then describe the study and give you a little bit of a taste of its findings. And then throughout the talk, I'll be showing how this qualitative work elaborates what we know from the quantitative literature on college as an equalizer. And I want to make 3 points here. First, that the equalizing literature kind of masks that there are real qualitative differences in the experience of and underemployment for college graduates who are first-generation students, that there's a much greater sense of desperation and much less of a safety net for those students. Secondly, these results tell us a little bit about how college equalizes to the degree that it does. And third, it tells us a little bit more about the experience of students of color or graduates of color as they enter the labor market. I was inspired to take on the study really from anecdotal observation of my own students, in which I seemed to be seeing a pattern, stress on the seemed, in which STAR students who were first generation college students were having a lot of difficulty landing a job after graduation, whereas more solid but less impressive students who had college educated parents were having a much easier time transitioning into the labor market. And why would that be? As I started to think about it, it's quite obvious that there are three different forms of capital that might differ across first generation college student status. Economic capital, the ability to do things like afford doing an unpaid internship. There's increasing attention to how important internships are for the transition into the labor force. Culture differences in cultural capital, the knowledge of exactly how the job search process should unfold, what a resume should look like, what you wear on an interview, how to be comfortable on an interview, where to be looking for jobs, etc. And third, social capital, which first of all can give you the cultural capital I just described, but also can directly tie you to employment opportunities. And I won't take the time to march through the literature, but I think many of you will recognize the citations that I put here because there's been a fair amount of work in all three of these areas. So I started to dive into the literature on the effects of college, and there was some good news there. And some of it was counter to my anecdotal impressions. So the first is that college seems to pay off for most majors and most institutions. The second is that college does appear to be an equalizer across social class background. And we know that from the work of Florencia Torch and from Raj Chetty's work, that really the inequality is on selection into college and also selection to college completion. But that for people who graduate from the same college, there seems to be an equalizing in payoff of the degree in terms of income mobility and employment. That said, there's lots of other related literatures that still suggest reasons why we should be concerned about inequalities for college graduates and just concerns about the payoff to college in general for people. And I won't march through the details of this slide, but I'll just highlight, there is a great concern about increasing precarity and instability in the labor market, the student debt crisis and the financial pressure that's putting on students, especially inequalities by race. And the fact that there's a fair amount of literature showing employment and earnings differences by race and gender, although a lot of that does seem to have to do with segregation by major and by occupation. So I wanted to kind of march into poking into these three questions. So the first is whether the anecdotes of my students' experiences are misleading and whether college really is a class equalizer, or whether there's something more going on that a qualitative investigation might show us. The second is, to the degree that college is an equalizer, how does it lead to equal paths? And the third is the role of race and ethnicity. So I set out to study students' post-college transitions as they unfold somewhat in real time through longitudinal qualitative work. I chose to focus on a single university in order to control for school quality, so I wasn't comparing across schools of different reputations. I chose to look at a large public university since most students study at universities like that rather than the elite universities that a lot of studies have focused on. And I chose to limit my focus to the liberal arts college within the university, which allowed me kind of a nice balance of being able to compare across some majors without the huge apples and oranges problem of comparing liberal arts students to engineering students and business students. Okay. The study consists of 3 interviews. The first happens in the senior year, the second shortly after graduation, and the third about a year to 18 months after graduation. Got pushed out a little bit by the COVID pandemic. The first and third interviews are quite in depth. The first one in person, the third one was supposed to be in person, but is now taking place on Zoom. Those interviews, some are as short as an hour, but many are 90 minutes, 2 hours, some even 2.5 hours. The middle interview was on the phone and was kind of a shorter check-in, and those were 30 to 60 minutes, most of them around 45 minutes. We also did some intensive follow-up with a very small subsample of 7 participants. We met with those participants bi-weekly for a 6-month period to really see what was happening as they searched for jobs and as they transitioned into the labor market or into graduate school. Did things like accompanied them on job interviews, not into the interview itself, but to the lobby and then afterwards to kind of hear a debrief, had meals with them, etc. The university was extremely generous and cooperative with the study. They provided me with the full population of college seniors in the liberal arts college, as well as their race, ethnicity, gender, and first generation student status, all identified by the students themselves on a survey, an incoming student survey. From those, I was able to put people in the cells, the first gen race, ethnic, gender cells of the study, and then I randomized in each of those cells to select people to interview. Let me just say right up front, I do not think that in a qualitative study like this, I can generalize just because I randomized. My goal really was not to have a very clear route of selection into the sample. And I especially didn't want to snowball or have professor recommendations because I'm interested in the role of social networks. So I certainly didn't want to select based on social network ties. The university also gave me students' SAT or ACT scores if they took them, and their GPAs upon graduation, and financial need ranking, which the financial aid office produces, which is on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the person won't qualify for any aid, 10 being highest need. This just gives you an overview of who's in the sample. We were aiming to have 7 people in each of these 12 cells. You see that we have Black, Latino, and white students. There was a very difficult decision not to include Asian students, which I can talk about later if people are interested, but largely had to do with the enormous amount of ethnic diversity within the Pan-Asian group and the problem of cell size. This, of course, was a problem with the Latino group as well, but for various reasons, I made this decision. So the goal was to have 7 in each cell. You see, we missed it, 1 cell. It was sort of shocking to us how few in the whole population, men of color, there were in the liberal arts college. And when we had opportunity to take a few more students, we did because of concerns about attrition. Luckily, we had very little attrition, as you'll see in a minute. Okay, so where are we now? We are still collecting data. This is incredibly preliminary. I'm really interested in your thoughts as I move forward. So this is a very early pass. And it would have been an even earlier pass last year. You wouldn't have had the third interview results at all. But we're still very much in the midst of I call this the drowning in data phase of qualitative research. So we have completed 281 interviews. The first wave is complete. The second wave is complete. I was thrilled, and this is largely due to the tenacity of the 3 people I mentioned at the front, that we were able to retain close to 90% of the sample. The third wave is almost complete. Not everyone is yet at the time for the third interview. So the vast majority of the cases graduated in the spring of 2019, but some people graduated in the fall of 2019 and 9 cases in the spring of 2020. So we have not yet approached those 9 cases. We will starting very soon. So we have interviewed 84 of the 95 people who were at the right time to be interviewed. So that's 88.4% of the wave 1 sample. And we did go back and we got a few people who disappeared at wave 2. We got them back at wave 3. I'm going to show you quickly 4 bar charts just to give you a sense of what this sample looks like on a few outcomes. Okay, so this is the percent and count of people who were in any kind of job or graduate school at the time of the 3rd interview. Here the N is 84 because that's how many 3rd interviews we've done so far. As you can see, the vast majority of people, 88%, have some kind of job or graduate school or both. Plenty of people in grad school have some work. Interestingly, you see that not only is there not a difference between the 1st generation and the 2nd generation, the not 1st generation students, but that, you know, in actual count of numbers here, more 1st generation students have some kind of employment or in graduate school. Again, small numbers, so, you know, even when it looks like there are differences, none of these are actually significant. For race, we also see similar numbers. If anything, Latinos have a little bit higher employment, and women and men are looking very much the same. We also look here at people who are in what we're calling a career-oriented job. So we ask everyone what they consider their job, whether it's a job that, you know, they see as somewhere, you know, on some step in a ladder towards a career, or whether it's a job just for money, just for now to get by. The money jobs tend to be things like, and we let people themselves define it. The money jobs tend to be things like working in retail. A lot of people had retail jobs during college and they kept them after college until they figure out what they're doing. So working in retail, servers in restaurants, the proverbial baristas, and some data entry jobs or similar jobs like that. And career-oriented jobs may be very low level, but still somewhere on a pathway. And there are paralegal, I wouldn't call paralegal a low-level job, but there are paralegals, there are sort of entry social work kinds of positions, entry editing, copy editing at a magazine kind of positions. Here we see that 68% of the sample is in a career-oriented job or grad school. Again, this interesting finding that if anything, the 1st generation people are doing a little bit better. Again, I wouldn't make much of that difference. I would call that sort of no difference. Here, you know, if anything, whites are doing worse, and men and women, again, doing pretty much the same. Median earnings, here we only have people who have earnings and are not in grad school, so the N drops to 48. 36.5 is the overall, and again, not seeing big differences. What may be slightly lower blacks compared to whites, and then this Latino is slightly larger, and you know, again, not much of a gender difference given the small numbers. Just if you're interested about debt here, there were 3 people who didn't know their debt level. Median debt is 30,000. The 1st gen in the sample do have higher debt. Latinos in the sample have higher debt, especially compared to whites, and women have higher debt than men. Okay, so that's the end of the numbers. I'll now, for the rest of the talk about the qualitative findings. So the first question, if you'll remember, was like whether my anecdotal impressions were misleading or not. So clearly these findings that I've just shown you are in line with the equalizing story. And there don't seem to be employment or earnings differences by 1st generation students compared to the children of college educated parents. But as I'm about to show you, when you take a closer look, the experiences of the under and unemployed 1st generation students does show really striking qualitative differences. They have a much greater sense of pessimism about their futures and about their current situations, a real sense of desperation, and much less of a safety net. So let me start with telling you a little bit about Hugo Moreno. Hugo Moreno is, he really, when you do qualitative work, sometimes there are certain cases that really stay with you and stand out to you. And I'll kind of never forget the first interview with him. He's a very gentle, sweet man. He talked very movingly about difficulties in his upbringing. His mother struggled a great deal and continues to struggle with alcoholism. His father is a mechanic who makes about $45,000 a year. He has 2 siblings, so that $45,000 is covering 5 people. He told a very moving story of having a very important test in high school, and his mother was going to drive him to school, and then she was incapacitated from drinking and was unable to drive him, and his father sort of risked skipping out of work to come home and drive him. Upon graduation, Hugo was unable to find a job. He spent sort of a few months kind of like living sort of with his parents and crashing at friends and not doing well. In February, a month before COVID hit, he got a job. He finally sort of gave up on finding something better, and his grandmother, who works in a nursing home, got him a job in the kitchen of the nursing home, where he was making $11 an hour part-time. Things went really badly at the nursing home after COVID hit, and several residents died, as well as more than several residents died, and staff members died, and he eventually quit over safety concerns. He bounced around in some other jobs, and he's currently at a temporary job at a cleaning company making $18 an hour. But he was when we talked to him, he was on a 2-week furlough because of the COVID case. So in talking with him about whether college was worth it, Hugo said, "I think it was like when I was at the nursing home. I got up one morning. I had to get up at 5 because I had to be there about 6:15 every morning. But I just got up and I'm like, school really wasn't worth it. Like, why the hell am I still getting up at 5 to be in this kitchen at 6:15? So it was just like it's been times where in my head, like, actually, it was never worth it. Like, I should never want to have done that because I'm in a worse situation than I was before. Like, I could have just maybe went to high school, made some money, don't worry about that debt, and then just got on with my life." And quite a few students talked in this way about almost being behind their peers from high school who went straight to work after high school and now have like 4 years of advancement into the work that they're doing. So now you're coming in 4 years behind and you're saddled with a bunch of debt. And speaking of debt, let's move to Jordan Harris. Jordan Harris is a tragic, she is our by far outlier. As I told you, median debt is $30,000. She has debt of $130,000. This is a tragic case of not knowing the difference, no one telling her, complete lack of cultural capital and social capital, no one telling her about the difference between private loans and grants, no one telling her that when she double majored in another college and that other college had a tuition premium, that it would inflate her debt, her tuition costs, and hence her debt. She too has been unable to find a job in the field that she's interested in, and which is in sort of youth services. And she now has a job through a friend's father owns a pizza shop, and she's delivering pizzas for him. Note that both of these jobs do come through personal ties. Social capital got both Jordan and Hugo jobs, but as first-generation students, their social capital is linking them to money jobs, not to career jobs. Jordan is trying to find another money job that actually pays real money and has more hours. And her friend suggested that she take her college degree off her resume because it marks her as overqualified. So Jordan says, I'm very stuck. So one of my colleagues suggested that I don't put my college education on my resume and I just put my high school accomplishments on there, which is valid. But like, I've paid $130,000 for this effing degree. Excuse me, these degrees. Trust and believe it's going to be on my resume. But I have thought about not including it, so I'd be able to get jobs like a cashier just to tide me over until I could find something that I want to do. Charlotte Geller, who was really a star student in college. She graduated with a 3.9 GPA. She was an honors student. She is interested in she was a psychology major and is interested ultimately in going to graduate school for clinical psychology. To boost that graduate school application, she wants good work experience in the area. She could not find something that she thought met that bill. Her mother, who did not go to college, is a classroom aide and said that she could get her a job with her, and she took her up on that. Because this job pays based on seniority, she makes a lot less money than her mother. She makes $19,000 a year. She says, it really bothers my mom that I have a degree and I make $10 an hour and she doesn't have a degree and she makes close to 20. My perspective when I was applying to it, though, was I would like to have employment because my student loan grace period ends soon. And yes, it's not what I anticipated doing, but it's a job. Even first generation students who we would call successful in terms of having found a job and a job that is in a career field describe struggling a lot more, particularly with finances and with pessimism about the future. So Nicolas Cortez Beck is a first generation student, Latino student from San Francisco. That will be relevant in a minute. All through college, he worked an enormous number of hours for pay, sometimes more than full time. He got an internship in his desired field. He's really interested in he's got a lot of interest, but sort of in communications and also in GIS and other kinds of data that he might use data analysis that he might use in business. But the internship, he had to leave after a month because he just couldn't make it work with all of the paid work hours. Instead, he started doing some translation here and there for legal aid cases, and this kind of redirected him. He's fluent in Spanish. This redirected him on a kind of social work path. He did, upon graduation, not upon graduation, but a few months after, got a job in social work as a counselor for at-risk youth. He was hired at $38,000. That's when we talked to him. At time 2, at time 3, he was had a raise up to $39,200. But what's really weighing on him is he has an enormous amount of student debt, $85,000. Here's where San Francisco comes in. His parents combined make $100,000, but they live in San Francisco, where $100,000 is below median income, household income, and he did not qualify for aid or sufficient aid because of their income. And yet there's no regional understanding, and they have 2 other children as well. So he's under a lot of financial strain. I asked him how it feels to pay his student loans. I said, is it manageable, not manageable? His answer was, is there a category below not manageable? He went on to explain kind of how he got sidetracked from the career he wanted to this career that he doesn't want. And which, he's doing well at now, but he understands is not a high-paying career in the long run. He says, he's talking about that internship. says a lot of the other internships weren't working for pay at all. And they were just focused on school, and they were able to accumulate a lot more information and a lot more functionalities of the job than I was, because I was always tired. I had these stressors that they didn't have, and it was pretty visible. They would always say things like, "You look tired. Did you get any sleep?" And I'm like, "No, because I got home from work at 2 a.m. and I had to wake up at 7 to come here." Their life was internship, school, go to parties. And obviously his was not. Another way, I mean, he didn't talk about this, but another way that I'm assuming that all of his work for pay affected him is that Nicolas struck me as an incredibly intelligent and intellectual young person. And I was somewhat surprised when I saw his GPA, and it was quite low. And I assume that that has something to do with all of those work hours. And given that his desired career likely requires graduate school, that is going to be a problem. So just, I know I'm rushing through all of this. There's just a lot to cover, but a quick summary of that question one, are the first generation students having a different experience or not? I think we can sort of clearly say qualitatively, they are having a different experience when they're not doing well. Now, when they're doing well, they're doing great. And I don't have time to show you the examples of the ones who are doing great. But for those who are struggling financially, they are really desperate. And I will also say that those with college-educated parents who are under and unemployed are also feeling stressed, especially since COVID. But the qualitative nature of their description is just it's palpably different. It's a little bit more like, well, I'm kind of sidetracked, but it isn't this long-term look of pessimism at the future. Moving on to the second question, how does despite what I've just shown you about the kind of little message that I never get, which is your internet is unstable. So if there are problems, please let me know if you're not hearing me. So there is no pattern of employment outcomes, from those bar charts by first generation student status. And this is surprising, given differences across the groups in economic, social, and cultural capital. So how does this equalizing occur? And what I want to argue is that the university and related entities like internships or mentorship programs of various kinds are doing a lot of work to kind of mimic individual level social capital and the cultural capital that might give students. And here is an example of Manuel Jimenez, who is a psychology major, first generation. She got very excited about research in one of her introductory psychology classes. And it was a large class. We don't really get to know the professor, but the TA introduced her to the professor because the TA was impressed by her. And the professor went on to hire her into his psych lab. And then advised her throughout her job search, giving her pieces of information she had no idea, like the fact that universities have their own HR systems and their own websites in which to search for jobs. And through this, she got a job at a highly prestigious university in another state after graduating as a research coordinator in the lab. Amber Adoa, who is a Black woman. Her parents are from Ghana. Her family, she is a very committed New York City person. She ran right back to New York as soon as she could. Her father is a taxi driver, her mother a hotel housekeeper. They live in a Section 8 apartment. She, throughout college, had a series of internships, and she participated in a mentoring program for minority students. She ultimately got a summer job after her junior year at an investment bank, where she says she did not even know that the goal was to get a job offer at the end of the summer for when she graduates. Like, she didn't understand that that was the system until kind of partway through the summer, when this mentor made it clear to her. She is I think has our highest earnings of $85,000 a year, salary of $85,000 a year. So Amber says, without the program, I don't think I would have gotten the job, and I don't think I would have gotten the full-time offer at the end, especially since she didn't know that that's what she was supposed to be aiming for. She would be assigned a coach. You would be assigned a coach who called you each week and just talked to you about the highs and lows, what's going on at your job, and sometimes point out maybe something that you should explore a bit more, like, oh, your manager said this, maybe you should go back and talk to them. Something you would never think was anything to be talking about. So that very subtle interpersonal kind of professionalism is what she was what this mentorship was giving her. Marquis Edwards, a Black first generation student, an incredibly charismatic person, just unbelievable social skills and energy, and he took on some very impressive leadership roles while at the university. He started as a biology major, and in the biology department, there was a mentorship program led by a professor for students of color and low-income students. Interestingly, Marquis was not a successful biology student. He didn't do well in biology classes, and he ended up switching his major and joined the liberal arts college, where he became a political science major. But this professor could have washed her hands of him at that time. She's got other students in her department in the purview of her program, but she didn't. And she followed him, and she made connections for him that have ultimately led to a really fantastic job that he holds now. So Marquis explained that she said, even though you left biomedical science, you would be great in public health. And I was like, I love public health. That seems like it sums up the work that I ultimately want to do. And she was like, Dr. Wu has got this grant that's doing stuff related to the work you're doing now, which was an internship she had also gotten him. It's just related to people and not to cells. So let me connect you with her. And she set up a meeting, and I went, and Dr. Wu was like, you're great, you'd be great. And then I had an interview the next week with them, and then they offered me the role. So now he's in a full-time job doing public health research. He's doing interviews with people about HIV risk. Okay, so quick summary here that university entities, programs, individuals, career counselors, we have lots of examples of career counselors helping people in job searches in really instrumental ways. Are key sources of cultural and social capital. They teach knowledge about the search process and create direct links. I also just want to reiterate that the first generation students often have social capital and cultural capital, but it leads them more to money jobs than to career jobs, and they really rely on these university-based resources to bridge into career jobs. Okay, and finally, let me talk quickly for time, and I'm sorry I don't have more time, on the role of race and ethnicity. The great equalizer literature primarily focuses on social class, and that may risk some differences in experience across race and ethnicity. Here again, we do see fairly similar outcomes for Black and Latino students in terms of levels of employment. Black students do seem to have lower earnings, somewhat lower earnings in this sample. But there's a lot of discussion of experiences at work related to race and ethnicity. Students talk about hostile or ignorant work interactions, what many people call microaggressions. And also there were some interesting discussions of what we might call, in Claude Steele's words, stereotype threat. So let me talk about Brittany King. Brittany King, I should say, by the way, I meant to say this with the first slide, these photographs are not of the, for anonymity, these are stock photos. These are not photographs of the people in the sample, and I'm using all pseudonyms. So Brittany King has college-educated parents. Her mother's an attorney and as in retirement became a social worker. Father's a scientist. Her mother had her working in law firms in the summers when she was a high school student. She has a lot of social capital, a lot of experience that's flowed through that social capital. She immediately got a job as paralegal upon graduation. She's in a small firm, 25 people total, 12 attorneys. There is one other Black person, a woman who's an attorney, other than Brittany. So no one else is Black in the firm. And she talked very poignantly about how she feels when she makes mistakes. She said, and she described in detail some of the mistakes she made about like filing court papers. She said, you just feel like you don't belong there because you don't see people like you there. And they're just like, sometimes you feel like you have to be the representation of, you feel the pressure of being the representation of your race. So it's like, if I mess up, and this is something I experienced growing up because I always worked in predominantly white environments. She went to mostly all white Catholic schools. It's kind of like, I'm their one exposure to the Black race. So besides what they see on TV and stuff, you have to set a good example to change their perspective of how they view your race. But that's like a pressure that I put on my head. But also, I think I have preconceived notions of how people perceive me. So I feel like I try not to fit into those stereotypes. So when I make mistakes, I was like, oh, now I'm messing up. Like I'm the girl who's always messing up. And I'm the only Black one there, and I'm the one who messes up all the time. Now, I have to say from her description, I would not describe her as someone who messes up all the time, but clearly this is how the structure of the situation is making her feel. There are also lots of mentions and discussions of kind of routine management of slights at work. Nicolas, who we talked about earlier, talked about a coworker who regularly refers to him as Puerto Rican. He is not Puerto Rican. He said, there's nothing wrong with being Puerto Rican, but I am not Puerto Rican. His mother is Colombian and his father is Italian. And this colleague who is white, sort of just whenever a fluent Spanish speaker is needed, she's like, oh, let's get Nicolas. He's Puerto Rican, which he found quite baffling. Xavier Stewart, who is working in a hospital in a neuroscience lab. Xavier is a very tall African-American man. He's quite broad-shouldered and muscular. He also has a flair for artistic and dramatic dress, which he enjoys. And he talked a lot, especially in the early months of his position, of feeling that all eyes were on him and suspicious eyes were on him in elevators and cafeterias, etc. So clearly employment and earnings are important, and we should feel good that the employment levels are similar across race, and that earnings, there is some evidence of depressed earnings for Blacks, but again, not big differences. But these other, this is the kind of stuff we can't see from the great equalizing quantitative literature, that this discomfort, this lack of feeling of integration into work groups is clearly problematic, and unfortunate that students feel like they're experiencing it so early on in their careers. So let me just conclude by saying that that the qualitative sample does, as we might think, reflect the quantitative patterns of college as an equalizer across class background. But that this kind of in-depth qualitative study allows us to add to that literature in several ways. First is that by looking just at employment and income levels, it might mask this like real qualitative difference in level of struggle for some first generation students. Secondly, that it helps us see exactly what universities can and do to ensure this kind of equalizing. And I think it suggests several things that universities should invest in to ensure that equalizing continues. And finally, it tells us the ways in which race and ethnicity matter, even beyond pecuniary rewards. And I think finally, it just tells us that it suggests that the equalizing is not literally just about the stamp of the degree, although clearly that matters. And it's not just about what people learn in classrooms, although I hope that matters. But instead, it's also about mentorship, which is building cultural capital and social capital, and that this comes through a variety of ways, and universities should push on all of these fronts. And very few of the first generation students in this study who are successful reach their success without this kind of investment from the university. So I'll stop there, and I will be very interested in what you have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Judith, for this very interesting presentation. And now we're going to open for discussion. So we have several questions, and I will start with the first question that was asked anonymously. So I'm going to read the question to you. For Hugo and Jordan, can we get a sense of precise majors or GPAs? And related to this is also, perhaps that is the person who asked the question, missed this, but does everyone in the liberal arts college major in liberal arts or similar? So.
Okay, so for Hugo, I feel silly. I really should have pulled these out to have them exact. So Hugo was a criminal justice major, and his I would have to look up his GPA. I think his GPA was not particularly high. I think it might have even been under 3. Jordan was a joint major. The college that had the premium was music, and she's really very interested in music. And she, I can sort of poke around while we're talking, but I think she was also a criminal justice major. And then what was the? But let me say that, let me just say a little bit more generally about major. So because I selected the cases randomly within the race first gen gender groups, I have more representation of large majors. And I kind of did that on purpose because I wanted enough cases within a major to be able to compare. So by far, the largest major is psychology, and at this university. And so I have a lot of psychology majors. And then I have almost all the other majors represented, but in smaller numbers. So I'm able to look within the psychology major, and I'm also able to look across majors. And interestingly, there does not see, I expected there to be a big difference by major. And the psychology majors have some resources that other people don't have. So, but there does not seem to be a pattern by major, which I'm finding surprising and which I want to poke more into. Again, I'm just beginning to sort of explore all of this. What was the second part of the question?
Yeah, the question was that if everyone in the liberal arts college majors in liberal arts or similar. So, yeah.
Oh, yeah. So the liberal arts college, it's humanities and social sciences. It is not the bench sciences, although there are neuroscience majors.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So the next question is by Andres Villatoro. Andres?
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
I had a question. So I was wondering, so I was really interested in, you said people like Hugo and Jordan got jobs through social networks, right? So I was wondering who those were. Maria Rendon, sociologist, I think UC Irvine, just came out with a book about, and one very small part of her book is college graduates from a neighborhood in LA not making great connections in college. So what they end up getting like lower class jobs, kind of like Hugo and Jordan, but they're getting these connections still through their neighborhood, like through their neighborhood growing up. So I was just kind of wondering if you had any more thoughts on that, or how are you finding this? This wasn't everyone, but a good amount were still getting jobs, still using their parents' networks, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering if you had a question on that.
Yeah, so I mean, Hugo got a job through his grandmother, and Jordan through her friend's father. And so, these are these personal network ties. I will say I was expecting to see, so that doesn't surprise me so much that those are the kinds of jobs that people are getting through network ties for first generation students. And there are like a lot of examples of that. Someone else is working in a store that her friend from high school is running with her own father, the friend's father. There are quite a few examples of those kinds of connections. I was sort of expecting to see a little bit more of direct ties to jobs on the high end from the privileged students. And in a pilot interview, I had like the quintessential example of this, of someone whose uncle works in development, and one of the uncle's clients, this person wanted a job in Paris because he was a French major, and the uncle's client has a company based in Paris. And so the connection was made and the person got a job in Paris. So that came up in a pilot interview, and I said, oh, I'm going to see a ton of that. I have to say, I have seen less of that than I might have thought. But I think that's largely because I think the social capital is a little bit more general on that end, because unless you're actually looking at something very specific that the parent has a tie to or the family member has a tie to, I think that form of social capital is a little more diffuse and sort of like how you go about it than the direct tie. But I have to say I was a little surprised not to see more of that.
Thank you. So we have another question by anonymous attendee. So I'm gonna read this. To follow up on anonymous, I think of criminal justice as a vocational degree. What were people in this major expecting to do if not work in criminal justice? It would be great to get a sense of students' self-reported occupational expectation as a first year in college, at the time they choose their major, and in their senior years.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, a lot of people in criminal justice, have ideas of going to law school. And so a lot of people are, wanting to do something along the way before they go to law school. But certainly there are people who have more vocational ideas and people who want to, I did not have, I had like one person who talked about wanting to be a police officer. We're perhaps not in a moment where people are aspiring to be police officers, but a few people sort of talked about wanting to be probation officers or wanting to be getting MSWs to serve ex-offenders, those kinds of careers. I guess the question is I'm not sure if the question is trying to get at the idea of whether people's expectations are being knocked down over time, or if people had low expectations to begin with. I'm sort of not quite latching on to the gist of what the question is. So we're limited in our Zoom world to be able to ask for more clarification. But I do think that that there are people who have, there are kind of quite a few stories of lofty goals that became sort of knocked down over time as people saw, largely as people saw kind of the weight of their student debt and their lack of interest in taking on more debt in graduate school. So a lot of the original law school people are putting that off into a more long run goal. I also want to say something I didn't say in reaction to the first anonymous question, which was about GPA. So I just got the GPA data, so I've been able to do very little with it thus far. But there does not, just a real quick look, mean GPA does not seem to be correlated with whether one is employed. But I need to obviously look much more, and that's obviously why I want to get the GPA, to look much more into how it's affecting the nature of employment and the patterns of employment.
Thank you.
And I also didn't mention that I think Jordan had a fairly high GPA.
Okay, so next question is by Benjamin Shostakovsky.
Hi there. Thanks for this talk. It was really, really fascinating. I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to the implications of your findings for the role of the university in society, and maybe kind of pose the provocative question of whether, universities, given that they have scarce resources, should they be reallocating resources away from kind of more explicitly educational functions and toward these kinds of functions that can help to endow students with cultural and social capital, or do you think that these things are, go more hand in hand, and that would be the wrong approach?
Okay, that's a great question. Thank you so much for it. I have lots of kind of swirling thoughts in reaction to it. I think that my own position on what the job of the university has been shifting over time. And I've been very concerned, especially in the liberal arts, about about over-focus on pre-professionalism and what, and a sort of watering down of a liberal arts education. But sort of going into this study, and certainly through this study, I have to say that I'm shifting somewhat, and I do feel, especially when you see the weight of this debt, I do feel the university really has a responsibility to students to make sure that that their university education does not hurt them. And so I do think that the university needs to and has a responsibility to invest in making sure that a solid liberal arts education is translates into a livable life for its graduates. So I do think that that investments in these areas make sense. But let me say something else, which speaks somewhat to your question, and I really wasn't able to focus on in terms of the time for this talk. I'm working on sort of another kind of level of analysis of these data, which is about whether the students think that college was worth it. I had that one quote from Hugo, but didn't talk about it otherwise. And really interestingly, despite like a lot of pessimism and anger about, being behind their high school only educated peers, there are very few people in the sample who say that college wasn't worth it. So even Hugo, that quote even gets a lot more interesting. I had to cut it off, but says that college really was worth it because of the change in his mindset and the expansion of his world that it gave him. People talked about sort of the intellectual value. They talked about the interaction with interesting peers. So all of the things that we hold up about the value of a liberal arts education, the students themselves say. And one of them, Manuela Jimenez, the person who's working as a data manager in a psych lab, her boyfriend is a truck driver. He graduated from high school and didn't go on in school, and he makes significantly more than she does, and she knows lots of people who make more than she does. Of course, her income is likely to grow over time. But she said that what college gives you is the ability to do interesting work. And she's very happy to be doing the work she's doing. It's interesting, even if it pays less than the hairdressers she knows at the moment. And so, I do think that this work, even though I told you a bunch of depressing things, the students themselves see an enormous value in a college education, and that's very encouraging. And I don't think we want to do anything that takes away from those gifts that they think college has given them.
Thank you, Judith. So we have time for one last question that was asked by anonymous attendee. So can you talk more about how your results might have been affected due to COVID? And if you have captured something in your data about what it is like to be a recent graduate in the pandemic?
Yeah, so I sort of avoided that in the talk because it's a whole talk in and of itself. A quarter of the sample overall either left or lost a job due to COVID or had hours cut back. I think 14 cases left or lost, and 10 cases had hours kind of dramatically cut back. This again cuts across the demographic groups, the first gen, not first gen, race and gender. Of course, we know that in the population at large, it's affected Black and Brown and low-wage workers much more than anyone else. But in this sample of college graduates, I'm not seeing that pattern. So of course, the numbers are so small, it would be hard to see it anyway. COVID. So in some, it depends if you're a glass half full or empty person. A quarter is, 3/4 weren't affected, but a quarter is not nothing. And for those who were affected, it really has derailed them. So again, we see a difference in the qualitative experience of it. So the first gen people who have lost jobs or hours due to COVID, they're kind of desperate. And the not first gen people who lost they feel they're not desperate. They're, Their parents are helping them. Lots of them are living at home. But they feel derailed. They feel like their futures are on hold. And there's some terrible stories. There was an Olympic hopeful and the Olympics were canceled, and that's devastating. There's someone who had like enormous success as a spoken word artist and was doing a college tour, canceled. So there is this real feeling of like, here they're ready to be launched and everything was put on hold or maybe permanently derailed, like the Olympic athlete. So I could say more about that, but I know we don't have time to go on too long.
Well, thank you so much, Judith. It was really a pleasure to have you present at the PSC Colloquium, even with a 1-year delay. So I hope we'll see you sooner than, sooner in person on campus. So thank you so much for this very interesting talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and I wish everyone well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judith.
Thank you.